The crack of Vernon Hask's hand against Sarah Drummond's face echoed off the false front stores like a rifle. Shot. She dropped to her knees in the dust of the town square, blood pooling from her split lip where it mixed with the dry earth beneath the auction block. "You'll hold your tongue, woman," Hask said, his voice carrying across 40 witnesses who stood frozen in the Tuesday afternoon heat. Sarah had protested the debt. 890s claimed when her dead husband had borrowed only 340. She'd called the second promissory note a forgery, and Hask had answered with his palm. Not one person moved. 40 yards away, at the edge of the blacksmith's yard, Caleb Stone's jaw set hard enough to crack teeth. His leather gloves creaked as his fists clenched. Beside him, Moses Webb the blacksmith whispered low, "That ain't Ben Drummond's signature. I'd stake my forge on it." Caleb turned, walked toward his horse. The crowd murmured disappointment. Silent Stone stays silent. By Wednesday morning, Sarah Drummond had nowhere left to go. The foreclosure notice nailed to her farmhouse door gave her until Friday at 11:69 hours to vacate land her husband had worked until fever took him 6 months back. Hask's clerk had done the nailing himself, a weasel-faced man named Pritchard who wouldn't meet her eyes as he drove the nail through the paper and into the wood frame. The sound carried across the empty yard, 3 strikes of the hammer, each one a nail in a coffin. "You got till Friday, ma'am," Pritchard said, already turning toward his horse. "Mr. Hask says anything left on the property becomes bank property." She'd loaded what she could into the wagon. Her husband's clothes, the iron cookware, a quilt his mother had sewn. And at the bottom of his trunk, she'd found his boots. The good ones he'd been buried in different boots, cheaper ones. Inside the left boot, folded tight, was a piece of paper. She hadn't opened it yet. Didn't know if she could bear to see Benjamin's handwriting. The wagon sat now at the edge of town, just past where the last building gave way to open country. The town wouldn't let her stay within limits. Vagrancy laws, they said. But they wouldn't run her off entirely, not yet. So she'd spent Tuesday night shivering under a canvas tarp, listening to coyotes sing in the distance, and trying not to think about how her cheeks still throbbed where Hask had struck her. The stars had been cold company. Caleb Stone rose before dawn, same as he had for 12 years. The stone fireplace in his cabin still held coals from the night before. He built up the fire, set the coffee pot on to boil, and stepped out into the blue-dark morning to mend the section of fence line he'd been putting off since Monday. The wire was old, rusted in places, and it sang a low metallic note as he worked it tight between the posts. His leather gloves were worn smooth at the palms. The smell of sage came strong on the pre-dawn wind, mixing with the scent of his own sweat and the creak of fence wire under tension. He'd been 20 miles from home when his wife went into labor, a cattle drive north, good money, and she'd told him to go. Baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks. But babies don't read calendars. By the time he rode back, they'd been in the ground 4 days. His daughter, his wife, both together, in a plot on the hill behind the church. 12 years he'd lived alone after that. 12 years of telling himself that keeping your head down was wisdom. That other people's troubles weren't his concern. That standing up for things only got you hurt. The town bell rang 6 times, carrying across the 8 miles between his ranch and the square. He paused in his work, wire cutters in hand, and listened to the sound fade into the morning. Then he saddled his horse and rode toward town. He passed the mercantile without stopping, past the livery, the land office, the bank where Vernon Hask kept his ledgers and his lies. He rode straight through to the far edge of town, where Sarah Drummond's wagon sat like a marker for everything he'd spent 12 years trying not to see. She was awake, sitting on the wagon's back gate with a tin cup in her hands. No steam rose from it. The coffee had gone cold, or maybe she'd never had any to begin with. Her face was turned toward the rising sun, and in the morning light he could see the bruise spreading purple across her cheekbone. He reined up 10 feet away. She didn't startle, just turned her head slow to look at him. "Stone," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the exhaustion underneath. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat. "You got a place to stay?" "I got this wagon." "That ain't what I asked." She set the cup down beside her, and he saw her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from cold. The night had dropped below 40 degrees. "I got no family, Mr. Stone. No friends willing to risk Hask's anger by taking me in. So yes, I got this wagon. It'll do until Friday." Caleb looked at her, really looked. 29 years old and already a widow. Face bruised from a banker's hand. Sleeping in the cold because the law said a forged signature was good enough to steal her home. "I got a spare room," he said. "Ain't charity. I need help with fence mending. Pays $1 a day, meals included." She studied him for a long moment. Pride and desperation fought each other in her eyes. Why? Because it's right. The silence stretched out between them while she weighed his words against 12 different kinds of suspicion that a woman alone learned to carry. Finally, she nodded. "I pay my debts, Mr. Stone. Every penny." "I know you do." Sarah rode beside Caleb back to his ranch, the wagon creaking behind them in the growing heat. She didn't speak, and he didn't press. Some silences were meant to be left alone. By the time they reached his property, the sun was high enough to make the sage shimmer. He showed her the spare room, small, clean, with a window that faced east. She set her few belongings on the narrow bed and stood there for a moment, just breathing. "There's soap and water in the basin," he said from the doorway. "When you're ready, I'll show you the fence line." She turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd found her in that wagon, something like hope flickered across her face. "Thank you." He nodded and left her to settle in. But settling in would have to wait, because at 10 o'clock that Wednesday morning, Caleb rode back into town with Sarah beside him, and a piece of paper in his pocket that might change everything or nothing at all. Judge Wickham's office sat above the general store, reached by an outside staircase that groaned under a man's weight. Caleb knocked twice and entered without waiting for an answer. The judge was a thick man gone soft in his middle years, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that had seen too many compromises. He looked up from his desk as Caleb and Sarah entered, and something like resignation crossed his face. Stone, Mrs. Drummond." He set down his pen. "I assume this is about the foreclosure." "It's about fraud," Caleb said. He pulled the paper from his pocket and laid it on the desk. "This is the original promissory note Benjamin Drummond signed. $340. Borrowed April 2nd, 1876 to be repaid over 2 years. His signature, witnessed by Moses Webb." Sarah's voice was quiet but steady. "I found it in my husband's boot. He kept it because he always paid his debts on time, and he wanted proof." Judge Wickham picked up the note, studied it. The paper was worn, but the signature was clear. Benjamin Drummond's careful script, practiced from years of signing contracts and bills of sale. Caleb laid a second paper on the desk. "This is the note Vernon Hask claims. $890, supposedly signed September 1876. Look at the signatures, Judge." Wickham held both papers to the light. The difference was obvious to anyone with eyes. The first signature had the fluid confidence of a man who'd signed his name 1,000 times. The second was hesitant, traced, wrong, in the way a forgery is always wrong. Close enough to fool someone who didn't look hard, but wrong. The judge was silent for a long moment. Then he set both papers down and folded his hands on the desk. "I see the discrepancy," he said. Sarah leaned forward, hope rising in her voice. "Then you can stop the foreclosure, Mrs. Drummond." Wickham's voice was heavy, and Caleb felt his gut tighten even before the man continued. "Mr. Hask's claim has been properly filed and witnessed. It's entered into the county registry. What you've brought me is concerning, yes, but it requires a formal hearing to adjudicate." "How long?" Caleb asked. "Court schedule is backed up 6 weeks, maybe 8. She's got 3 days, Caleb said, and his voice carried an edge now. "You're telling me she loses everything while we wait for you to schedule a hearing about a forgery you can see with your own eyes?" Wickham's face tightened. "I'm telling you that's how the law works, Mr. Stone. I don't make the rules, but you enforce them. I enforce them fairly, for everyone." The judge stood, and there was something in his posture, not defiance, but fear. "The foreclosure proceeds on Friday as scheduled. You can file a formal challenge, and we'll hear it when the docket allows. That's all I can do." The door opened behind them, and Vernon Hask stepped in, his timing so perfect it couldn't be accident. He must have been watching from across the street. "Judge Wickham," Hask said pleasantly, nodding to the room. "Mr. Stone, Mrs. Drummond, I hope we're not having any misunderstandings about Friday's proceedings." Caleb turned to face him, and it took everything he had not to put his fist through the banker's teeth. "You forged that note. That's a serious accusation." Hask's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Do you have any proof? Any witnesses to this alleged forgery?" "The proof is on the judge's desk." What I see on the judge's desk is a dispute between 2 documents. These things happen. Memory fails. Widows get confused about their late husband's debts." He looked at Sarah with something cold and satisfied in his expression. "It's unfortunate, but the law is clear. Filed claims take precedence." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but her voice stayed level. "My husband never borrowed more than $340 from you. That signature is false. Then I suppose we'll see what the court decides." Hask tipped his hat to the judge. "In 6 weeks. Or 8. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Mrs. Drummond, I'll expect the property vacated by 11 o'clock Friday. Any belongings left behind will be forfeit." He descended the stairs, his boots echoing on the wood. Judge Wickham wouldn't meet their eyes. "I'm sorry. That's all I can do." Sarah's face had gone pale, and when Caleb took her arm to steady her, he could feel her trembling. Not from fear, from rage and helplessness. and the bitter understanding that the law could be right there in front of a man, clear as daylight, and he'd still rule against it because ruling took courage, and courage was a luxury this judge couldn't afford. They descended the stairs in silence. At the bottom, Sarah stopped and turned to face the street, the town, the buildings that had been her home for 3 years. "I've got 3 days," she whispered. "He's got forever." Caleb didn't take Sarah back to the ranch. Not yet. He rode to the blacksmith's yard instead, where Moses Webb was working a piece of iron in the forge, the coal smoke rising thick and the smell of hot metal sharp in the noon air. Moses looked up as they dismounted, taking in Sarah's pale face and Caleb's tight jaw. He set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Judge wouldn't hear it?" he asked. "He heard it," Caleb said. "He just won't do anything about it. Says it needs a formal hearing." 6 weeks, maybe 8? Moses spat into the dirt. "She's got 3 days. I know." The blacksmith walked to his workbench and pulled out a thick ledger, its pages worn from years of use. He opened it carefully, running his finger down entries that went back decades. "Come here, both of you," he said. Caleb and Sarah joined him at the bench. The ledger was filled with dates, names, and descriptions, a record of every contract, will, bill of sale, and legal document Moses had witnessed in his 40 years of business in this town. "I witnessed Benjamin Drummond's signature 40 times, Moses said, flipping through pages. "Land purchases, livestock sales, his will, equipment contracts, every time I made a note. That's how I do business. Careful records, so nobody can say later I didn't do it right." He stopped at a page dated 1874 and pointed to an entry. "Here, bill of sale for 3 breeding heifers. Ben's signature." He flipped forward. "Here, 1875, lease agreement for grazing rights, same signature." And he kept turning pages, pointing out entry after entry, each one showing Benjamin Drummond's name in the same clear, confident hand. Then Moses pulled the forged note from Caleb's pocket and laid it beside the ledger. "That," he said, tapping the forged signature, "ain't Benjamin Drummond's hand. I'd stake my forge on it." Sarah was staring at the ledger, tears building in her eyes. But the judge saw the difference. "He just won't act on it alone," Moses finished. "That's because Wickham's scared. Hask holds paper on half this town, and men who hold paper hold power." He looked at Caleb. "But Wickham said he'd need witnesses, said these things need proper adjudication. What if we gave him more than 1 witness? What if we gave him a dozen?" "You think others would come forward?" Caleb asked. "I think there's men in this town who knew Ben Drummond, who did business with him, who saw his signature on documents they still have locked in their own strongboxes." Moses closed the ledger carefully. "And I think some of them are tired of watching Vernon Hask steal what ain't his." Hask will come after anyone who stands against him," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe," Moses said. "But there's a difference between coming after 1 man and coming after 20. Even Hask ain't that bold." He looked at Caleb. "You willing to ask?" Caleb thought about 12 years of keeping his head down. 12 years of telling himself that other people's fights weren't his concern. He thought about his wife and daughter buried on the hill, and how he'd spent every day since then choosing safety over everything else. "I'm willing," he said. Moses nodded slowly, then walked back to his forge. The iron he'd been working had cooled, and he thrust it back into the coals, working the bellows until the metal began to glow orange again. "What are you making?" Sarah asked. "Gate iron," Moses said. "Repair piece for that broken gate at your farm. Figured you'd need it when you go back." Sarah's voice caught. "If I go back?" "When?" Moses said firmly. He pulled the glowing iron from the forge and set it on the anvil. The hammer rang 3 times as he shaped it, each strike sending sparks into the dusty air. "Things that break can be mended, Mrs. Drummond. Sometimes they come back stronger than before." They left Moses to his work and rode back to Stone's ranch as the afternoon heat settled heavy over the valley. Sarah was quiet on the ride, her hands gripping the wagon seat, her eyes distant. At the ranch, Caleb showed her the fence line that needed mending, a 1/4 mile of sagging wire and posts that needed resetting. She nodded and picked up a pair of wire cutters without being asked. They worked side by side through the afternoon, the sun beating down on their backs. Sarah's hands weren't used to the work. She'd been a farmer's wife, not a ranch hand, and within an hour her palms were bleeding where the wire had cut through her thin gloves. Caleb saw but didn't say anything. He just went to the barn and came back with a roll of clean cloth. He took her hands gently, wrapped the cloth around the worst of the cuts, and tied it off. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "Yes, I do." Her voice was steady. "I told you I'd pay my way. I meant it." They worked until dusk, when the light turned gold and the heat finally broke. Caleb built up the fire in the stone hearth, while Sarah washed the dirt and blood from her hands at the basin. Then she moved to the stove, without asking, without hesitation. and began preparing dinner from the supplies she found in his cupboard. He watched her work, this woman who'd been beaten and robbed and cast out, now standing in his kitchen cooking beans and cornbread like it was the most natural thing in the world. There was dignity in it, he thought, a refusal to be broken. When they sat down to eat, the first meal they'd shared under his roof, Caleb said, "Grace for the first time in 12 years." The words came awkward, rusty from disuse, but Sarah bowed her head and listened. "Amen," she said softly when he finished. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, the smell of wood smoke and cooking filling the small cabin. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like something other than survival. It felt like home. Then boots sounded on the porch outside, and Tom Brennan's voice called through the door. "Boss, we got a problem." Caleb opened the door to find his foreman standing there, hat in hand, worry written across his weathered face. "Hask's clerk was at the land office today," Tom said, "filing a water rights claim on the Drummond property. He's not just after her land, he's after the creek." Thursday morning arrived with a knock on Caleb's door before the sun had cleared the eastern hills. He'd been awake for an hour already, feeding the fire and making coffee. But Sarah was still asleep in the spare room when Ruth Carver arrived in her wagon. Ruth was 52, a seamstress who ran the boarding house on the edge of town. She had iron gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by much of anything. She climbed down from her wagon with a bundle of cloth in her arms. "Mrs. Drummond here?" she asked without preamble. "She is," Caleb said. "What's this about?" "This is about doing something I should have done 5 years ago." Ruth pushed past him into the cabin just as Sarah emerged from the back room, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, her wrapped hands stiff at her sides. Ruth set the bundle on the table. "I brought you a dress, a proper one. Yours is torn and dirty, and if we're going to stand up in front of this town, we're going to look like we deserve to be taken seriously." Sarah stared at her. "Mrs. Carver, I don't understand." 5 years ago, Vernon Hask did to my husband what he's doing to you," Ruth said, her voice flat and hard. "Claimed he'd borrowed money he never borrowed. Forged a document showing interest that was never owed. My husband paid $200 to make it go away because he was scared. Scared of losing the store. Scared of Hask's connections. Scared of standing up." She looked Sarah straight in the eye. "We paid that money, and it's eaten at me every day since, because paying a lie doesn't make it true. It just makes you a coward." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be angry." Ruth pushed the dress toward her. "Get dressed. We're going to Moses's Forge at noon. There's others who want to talk." She left as abruptly as she'd arrived, her wagon rattling back down the road toward town. Sarah held the dress, dark blue cotton, simple but well made, and looked at Caleb with something like wonder in her eyes. "She's going to help?" "Sounds like it." "But Hask could come after her." "He could," Caleb said. "But sometimes people get tired of being scared." They rode to town at 11:30, arriving at the blacksmith's yard to find 8 people already gathered. Moses was there, of course, and Ruth. Tom Brennan stood with 3 other ranch hands from neighboring properties, 2 older men Caleb recognized from the general store, and a young clerk he didn't know at all. Moses caught Caleb's eye and nodded toward the group. "Everyone here knew Ben Drummond. Everyone here has seen his signature on documents they'd swear to." For the next hour, they talked. Moses showed his ledger, Ruth told her story. Each man in turn described documents they'd witnessed or contracts they'd signed alongside Benjamin Drummond, and every one of them said the same thing. The signature on Hask's note was wrong. "So we testify," Tom said. "Saturday noon, town square. Make it public, make it loud, and make Hask answer for what he's done." The sheriff won't back us," one of the ranch hands said. "He owes Hask money, too." He will, if there's enough of us," Moses said. "A sheriff can ignore 1 man. He can't ignore 20. Sarah spoke up, her voice steady despite her bandaged hands. "If you do this, Hask will come after you. All of you. He'll call in loans, he'll spread rumors, he'll make your lives hard." "He already makes our lives hard," Ruth said. "At least this way we'll have something to show for it." The young clerk, his name was Daniel Pritchard, same as the man who'd nailed the foreclosure notice, cleared his throat nervously. "I need to tell you something about Judge Wickham." Everyone turned to look at him. "I've been working for Mr. Hask for 2 years, Daniel said. "Recording claims, filing documents, that kind of thing, and I know why the judge won't rule against him." He swallowed hard. "Hask's been sending anonymous letters to the judge, letters about his daughter, about her safety, about what could happen to a young woman if she's not careful walking home at night." Caleb felt his blood go cold. "He's threatening her?" "Not directly, never directly, but the meaning's clear enough." Daniel pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I quit this morning. I can't file another false claim. I can't be part of this anymore." And I wanted you to know, Judge Wickham isn't corrupt, he's scared. Moses pounded his anvil once, the sound ringing out like a bell. Then we protect him too. We stand so loud and so public that Hask can't touch anyone without the whole town seeing. We need 12 more, Tom said. 12 more willing to stand, and we'll have the 20 the sheriff can't ignore. I'll talk to the men at the mill, one of the ranch hands said. I'll talk to the merchants, Ruth added. They made their plans quickly, efficiently, with the urgency of people who knew time was running short. Friday night, they'd gather again at the forge. Saturday noon, they'd march to the town square. Sarah stood silent through it all, tears running down her face, her bandaged hands pressed to her mouth. After the others dispersed, Caleb and Sarah rode back toward the ranch. They were halfway there when a rider came up behind them fast, and Caleb recognized Vernon Hask's gray gelding before he saw the man himself. "Stone," Hask called out. "We need to talk, now." Caleb reined up and turned his horse. Sarah stayed close beside him, her chin lifted despite the fear in her eyes. Hask rode up alongside them, his face flushed with anger. "I've been hearing things. Hearing you're stirring up trouble in town? Trying to gather witnesses against me?" Not against you," Caleb said, evenly. "For the truth. The truth is that woman owes me money." Hask pointed at Sarah. "And you're harboring my debtor without my consent. That's theft of labor, Stone. That's a criminal act. She's working for me, $1 a day, legal wages." "We'll see what the sheriff says about that." Hask's horse danced sideways, sensing its rider's agitation. "But here's what you need to understand, Stone. I hold the note on your water rights. $600, due in 30 days. You keep pushing this, and I'll call that note early. I'll take your ranch the same way I'm taking hers." The words hit like a physical blow. Caleb's water rights note, he'd borrowed against it 3 years back to buy breeding stock, and he'd been paying it down slow and steady. But the contract had a clause that allowed early collection if the borrower was deemed a credit risk. "You'd do that?" Caleb asked quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my legitimate business interest." Hask's smile was cold. "You've got a choice, Stone. Walk away from the Drummond woman and keep your ranch, or stand with her and lose everything." He leaned forward in his saddle. "I've got the law on my side. I've got the judge in my pocket. And I've got more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. What do you have?" Sarah's voice cut through the tension, strong and clear. "He has something you'll never have, Mr. Hask. He has his soul intact." Hask's face darkened. He jerked his horse around and spurred it back toward town, leaving them in a cloud of dust. Sarah turned to Caleb, anguish written across her face. "I'll leave tonight. I won't let you lose your ranch for, No," Caleb said. "But he'll take everything from you. He'll try." Caleb looked at her, and for the first time in 12 years, he felt something other than the hollow numbness he'd been carrying. He felt alive. "I've spent 12 years keeping my head down, Sarah. 12 years telling myself that staying safe was the same as staying alive. It ain't. It's just a slower way to die. Your ranch is land and water and wood. Important, sure, but it ain't worth my soul." He reached over and took her bandaged hand gently. "Some debts don't show on ledgers, and I've been in debt to silence long enough." They rode back to the ranch as the sun climbed higher, and neither of them spoke again until they reached the cabin. But when Sarah dismounted, she looked at him with something more than gratitude, with the kind of respect that passes between people who've seen each other's courage and found it true. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He stood on his porch with his coffee, looking out at land he might lose, and found he didn't regret a single choice he'd made since Tuesday. Some prices were worth paying. Thursday evening settled over the ranch like a held breath. The sun bled out behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust, and Caleb stood in the yard with an axe in his hands, splitting firewood with a violence that had nothing to do with winter preparation. Each swing of the blade was an answer to Vernon Hask's threat. Each crack of wood splitting was a reply to 12 years of silence. Sarah watched from the porch, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. When Caleb finally stopped, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cooling air, she stood and walked down the steps to where he'd buried the axe in the chopping block. "You don't have to do this," she said. He pulled the axe free, set it aside, and looked at her. "Yes, I do. Why? You don't owe me anything. We barely know each other. I know you got beaten in front of 40 witnesses and not one of them moved to help." He wiped his face with his sleeve. "I know you're being robbed by a man who hides behind paper and judges who won't do what's right. And I know that if I walk away from this, I'll spend the rest of my life being the same man I've been for 12 years. Alive, but not living." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases. "I found this in Ben's boot, with the note." She handed it to him. Caleb unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was the same as the signature on the original promissory note. Benjamin Drummond's clear, careful script. April 7, 1806, borrowed $340 from V. Hask at 8% annual interest for purchase of seed and equipment, to be repaid over 24 months. I keep this copy to prevent any future dispute about terms or amount. In the margin, Ben had written, "A man who'd cheat you once will cheat you twice. Keep your proof." Caleb stared at the paper, at the date written in the margin, and something clicked in his mind. When did your husband die? August 12th. Fever took him in 3 days. And Hask's forged note claims to be from September. Sarah nodded slowly. Ben couldn't have signed anything in September. He was already in the ground. Caleb folded the paper and handed it back to her. That's our proof. Not just that the signature's wrong, but that it's impossible. Dead men don't sign documents. For the first time since Tuesday, Sarah smiled. It was small and sad and hard-won, but it was real. Ben always said Hask was a snake. I guess even dead, my husband's still protecting me. They walked back to the cabin together, and Sarah set about making dinner while Caleb cleaned himself up at the basin. The smell of frying salt pork and beans filled the small space, mixing with the wood smoke from the hearth. When they sat down to eat, Caleb noticed Sarah was moving her bandaged hands more easily, the worst of the swelling gone down. She caught him looking and held up her palms. "They'll heal," she said. "Everything does, given time." "Not everything." "No," she agreed quietly. "Not everything. But most things. Most people." She set her fork down. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you really walk away on Tuesday? At the town square, when Hask struck me, everyone thought you were scared. But you weren't, were you?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, his coffee cup warm between his hands. The fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere outside a coyote called to its mate. 12 years ago, he said finally, I lost my wife and daughter. I was off on a cattle drive when she went into labor early. Came home to find them both buried." He stared into his cup. "For a long time after that, I blamed myself. Thought if I'd been there, if I'd stayed home instead of chasing money, maybe I could have saved them. Maybe I could have done something." "It wasn't your fault," Sarah said gently. "Maybe not. But I lived like it was, kept my head down, stayed out of trouble, told myself that caring too much about things, about people, only led to pain." He looked up at her. "Tuesday, when I saw Hask strike you, I wanted to break his neck right there in that square. But I knew that if I did, if I let my anger control me, it wouldn't help you. It'd just get me arrested and leave you with no one. So you walked away to think." "I walked away to decide if I was ready to stop being scared." He set his cup down. "Turns out I was. I just needed a minute to realize it." Sarah reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her bandages were rough against his calloused palm, 2 sets of wounds that understood each other. "Thank you," she said, "for that minute and for everything since." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and afterwards Sarah washed the dishes while Caleb banked the fire for the night. It was a domestic scene, simple and ordinary, and it struck him how much he'd missed this. Not romance, not passion, but the quiet companionship of sharing a space with someone who understood work and loss and the cost of standing up. A knock at the door broke the evening stillness. Caleb opened it to find Moses standing there, his leather apron still on, his face creased with satisfaction. 14 more, Moses said without preamble. 14 men and women who'll stand Saturday. Tom got 4 from the mill, Ruth got 6 from the merchants. The rest just came forward on their own, saying they'd heard we were gathering witnesses and they wanted to be counted. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. That's 22 total. 22 people who knew Ben Drummond, 22 people who can testify his signature, and every one of them knows the risk. Moses stepped onto the porch, lowering his voice. Hask came to my shop this afternoon, threatened to call my tool supplier's loan if I didn't back down. I told him to go to hell. He's desperate, Sarah said from inside the cabin. He's dangerous, Moses corrected. But so are we, if we stand together. He looked at Caleb. Tomorrow night, we gather at the forge. 9 o'clock, after the town's gone quiet. We'll walk through the testimony, make sure everyone knows what to say and how to say it. Saturday noon, we march to the square. And if the sheriff won't listen, Caleb asked, then we make enough noise that he's got no choice. Moses' face hardened. Judge Wickham's daughter will be with us too. She heard about her father's threats, and she wants to stand. Says no man should have to choose between justice and his child's safety. After Moses left, Caleb and Sarah stood together on the porch, looking out at the darkness and the stars beginning to emerge overhead. Tomorrow was Friday, the day Sarah was supposed to lose everything. Instead, they'd spend it preparing to fight. I'm scared, Sarah said softly. Me too. But we're doing it anyway. Yeah, Caleb said. We are. Friday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of day that made a man think about endings and beginnings in equal measure. Sarah's foreclosure deadline was 6 hours away, and Vernon Hask was already making sure the town knew it. By the time Caleb and Sarah rode into town at 8 o'clock, word had spread like wildfire through the streets. They could feel it in the way people looked at them, some with sympathy, others with the careful neutrality of those who'd chosen survival over courage. Mrs. Henderson at the general store wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes when she came in for supplies. The clerk at the land office suddenly found urgent business in the back room when Caleb approached his counter. Even the children playing in the street seemed to sense something wrong, their games subdued, their voices hushed. Hask had been busy. They heard the rumors at the livery, whispered between stable hands who didn't know Caleb was listening from the next stall over. Stone's keeping that woman for immoral purposes. She's working off her debt on her back, not with honest labor. He's trying to stir up trouble because he can't pay his own notes. At the bank, Hask had posted a notice on the door. Public auction. Friday, 11:00 a.m. Drummond property. 160 acres with creek access, sold to satisfy outstanding debt, all sales final. Sarah stood in front of that notice for a long moment, her bandaged hands clenched at her sides. He's not even waiting for a judge anymore. He's just taking it. Let him post his notice, Caleb said. We'll post ours tomorrow. But the whispers grew louder as the morning wore on. By 10 o'clock, when they met Ruth Carver at her boarding house, the seamstress's face was tight with anger. Hask's been to every business on this street, she said, leading them into her parlor where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the scent of lavender sachets. Told them, anyone who stands with you tomorrow will find their credit called in, their loans accelerated, their reputations ruined. She poured coffee with shaking hands. 2 of our witnesses backed out this morning, said they couldn't risk it. How many does that leave? Sarah asked. 20, still enough to make noise. Ruth set down the pot. But I won't lie to you, people are scared. Hask's got half this town by the throat, and the other half is too worried about becoming the next victim to do anything about it. Caleb took his coffee but didn't drink. What about Judge Wickham's daughter? She's still coming. Says her father's been living in fear long enough, and she won't let Hask's threats control their lives anymore. Ruth sat down heavily. But Stone, you need to understand something. Even if we testify tomorrow, even if we prove that note is forged, Hask might still win. He's got lawyers. He's got connections. He's got power, Caleb finished. I know. But power built on lies is fragile. All we have to do is push. They left Ruth's and walked toward the blacksmith's yard, arriving just as the 11 o'clock bell began to toll from the church steeple. The sound echoed across the town square, marking the exact moment when Sarah Drummond officially lost her home. Moses was at his forge, working iron with steady, deliberate strikes. He looked up as they approached, his face grim. It's done then, he said. The foreclosure? Yes. Sarah's voice was steady, but Caleb could see the pain in her eyes. My husband built that house. We were going to raise children there. Now it belongs to a man who stole it with a forged signature. Moses set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his apron. Come inside. They followed him into the back of his shop, where the smell of coal smoke and hot metal was strongest. Waiting there was a young man Caleb recognized from the bank, Daniel Pritchard, the clerk who'd quit Hask's employment 2 days ago. I have something to tell you, Daniel said without preamble. His hands were shaking, but his voice was clear. About Judge Wickham, about why he won't rule against Hask. We know, Caleb said, the threats against his daughter. It's more than threats. Daniel pulled a packet of letters from his coat. These are copies. I made them before I quit. Anonymous letters sent to the judge over the past 6 months. They describe his daughter's daily routine, where she walks, who she sees, what time she comes home. His face had gone pale. The last one said, accidents happen to careless young women. It would be a shame if your daughter became careless. Sarah gasped. Ruth, who'd followed them in, put a hand over her mouth. That's not business pressure, Moses said flatly. That's criminal intimidation. I know. Daniel's hands clenched on the letters. I didn't make these copies myself. Hask kept them locked in his office. But I knew where he hid the key, and I knew they were wrong. I've been working up the courage to do something about it for months. Why now? Caleb asked. Because I watched him strike Mrs. Drummond in the town square, and nobody did anything. And I realized that if I kept working for him, kept filing his false claims and keeping his secrets, I was just as guilty as he was. Daniel held out the letters. Judge Wickham isn't corrupt. He's terrified. And if we can show these letters tomorrow, if we can prove Hask's been threatening his family, then maybe the judge will finally be free to do what's right. Moses took the letters carefully, as if they were made of something more fragile than paper. This changes things. This puts Hask in a position he can't talk his way out of. It also makes him more dangerous, Ruth said quietly. A cornered rat bites hardest. Then we don't corner him alone, Caleb said. We do it in front of the whole town, where he can't bite without everyone seeing. They spent the next hour planning. Daniel would testify about the letters. Moses would present his ledger of Benjamin Drummond's signatures. Ruth would tell her story of being forced to pay a fraudulent claim, and one by one, the other witnesses would add their voices to the chorus. It has to be airtight, Moses said. No gaps, no room for Hask to wriggle through. It will be, Daniel promised. I know how he operates, I know his weaknesses, and I know he forged that note alone, because he's too paranoid to trust anyone else with his schemes. He looked at Sarah. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. You're speaking up now, Sarah said. That's what matters. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Caleb and Sarah prepared to leave. They were halfway to their horses when a figure stepped out from behind the blacksmith shop. A young woman, in a blue dress, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. Mr. Stone? Mrs. Drummond? Her voice was soft but steady. I'm Elizabeth Wickham, the judge's daughter. Caleb removed his hat. Miss Wickham. I wanted you to know I'll be there tomorrow, in the square, standing with you. She lifted her chin, and there was steel in her eyes that reminded Caleb of her father before fear had worn him down. My father has spent 6 months terrified for my safety. But living in fear isn't living at all, and I won't let Vernon Hask control our lives anymore. It could be dangerous, Sarah warned. I know. Elizabeth's smile was small but fierce. But I'd rather be in danger standing for what's right than be safe living under a tyrant's thumb. My father needs to see that I'm not afraid. Maybe then he won't be either. After she left, Moses came to stand beside them. 20 witnesses, I said. Plus Daniel with the letters, plus Elizabeth Wickham herself, showing Hask's threats have no more power. He looked at the western sky, where the sun was beginning its descent. Tomorrow we stand, and Hask's gonna learn what it feels like to be outnumbered. Sarah took Caleb's hand as they mounted their horses. Do you think we can win? I think we can't lose, Caleb said, as long as we stand. They rode back to the ranch through the cooling evening, and for the first time since Tuesday, Sarah looked like someone who believed in tomorrow. Friday evening settled over Stone's ranch with the weight of everything unsaid. Caleb built up the fire in the stone hearth while Sarah prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. They moved around each other in the small cabin with the easy rhythm of people who'd learned to share space, without friction, but there was a tension underneath, the knowledge that tomorrow would change everything. One way or another, they ate in silence, the fire crackling and popping, filling the quiet spaces between them. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was soft. What will you do if Hask calls your note early, if you lose your ranch because of this? Caleb set down his fork. I'll figure something out. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. He looked at her across the table, firelight casting shadows on her bruised face. I've spent 12 years on this land, Sarah. Built it up from nothing, raised cattle, mended fences, fixed the roof every spring when the winter storms tore it apart. It's mine in a way that goes deeper than paper. But paper's what the law recognizes. I know. He pushed his plate away, suddenly not hungry. But I'm done letting paper decide what I stand for. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and moved to the fire, staring into the flames. Ben used to say that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he was willing to lose for what's right. Her voice caught. I never understood what he meant until now. Caleb joined her by the fire, and for a long time, they just stood there, watching the flames dance and shift. The smell of wood smoke filled the cabin, mixed with the fading scent of supper, and the leather and dust smell that seemed to live in the walls themselves. Finally, Caleb spoke, and the words came rough and unsteady, like pulling splinters from a wound that had been festering for 12 years. I wasn't there when my wife died. Sarah turned to look at him, but she didn't speak, just waited. She went into labor 3 weeks early. I was 200 miles north with a herd of cattle, making money we needed to keep this place running. His hands clenched at his sides. She sent word with a rider, but by the time I got it and rode back, she'd been in the ground 3 days. Her and our daughter both. Caleb, I told myself afterwards that I'd done what I had to do, that a man's got to provide for his family, and that meant sometimes you had to be away. But the truth is, I chose those cattle over being home. I chose money over presence. What? He finally looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and they died alone because of it. It wasn't your fault, Sarah said firmly. Women die in childbirth. Babies die. You couldn't have known. Maybe not, but I could have been there. His voice broke. I could have held her hand. I could have told her I loved her one more time. I could have... He stopped, unable to continue. Sarah put her hand on his arm, her bandaged palm rough against his sleeve. So you spent 12 years punishing yourself, keeping your head down, staying out of everyone's business, because if you didn't care about anything, you couldn't lose anything. Something like that. And Tuesday, when you saw Hask strike me, you had to decide if you were ready to stop punishing yourself. If you were ready to care again, knowing it might cost you everything. Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard, Sarah said softly. They stood together in front of the fire, and slowly, carefully, Sarah reached up and put her arms around him. He stiffened. At first, it had been so long since anyone had touched him with kindness. But then he let himself fold into her embrace, his face against her shoulder, 12 years of grief finally breaking loose. He cried quietly, his shoulders shaking, and she held him through it, this woman who'd lost her own husband, who understood what it meant to carry the weight of absence. When he finally pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve, she was crying too. Tomorrow, she said, when we stand in that square, we're not just standing for my farm. We're standing because we're both tired of letting fear decide how we live. Yeah, Caleb managed. We are. They sat down by the fire, shoulders touching, and talked late into the night. About Ben Drummond and the woman Caleb had married when he was 23, about the children they'd both lost and the futures that had died with them, about what it meant to start over when you thought all the starting was behind you. Somewhere past midnight, Sarah fell asleep against his shoulder. Exhausted from 3 days of fear and work and hope, Caleb sat still, not wanting to wake her, watching the fire burn down to coals. He thought about tomorrow, about standing in front of the town with 20 witnesses and a packet of threatening letters and the ghost of Benjamin Drummond's signature to guide them. He thought about Vernon Hask's face when he realized the people he'd intimidated were no longer afraid. And he thought about what came after. Win or lose, there was no going back to the man he'd been on Monday. That man was dead. Had died the moment Sarah Drummond fell to her knees in the dust, and he'd decided he couldn't walk away. As the first gray light of Saturday dawn began to seep through the windows, Caleb carefully shifted Sarah so she could sleep more comfortably, covered her with a blanket, and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold and still. No wind, no birdsong yet, just the vast silence of the high desert waiting for the sun. In 5 hours, they'd ride to town. In 6, they'd stand in the square where Sarah had been struck, and they'd speak truth to power in front of everyone who'd stayed silent on Tuesday. Caleb had no idea if it would work. But he knew, standing there in the pre-dawn darkness with his coffee cup warming his hands, that he was finally ready to find out. Some debts were paid in silence, others in witness. Today, he'd pay his. Saturday morning arrived with a stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. Caleb and Sarah left the ranch at 9 o'clock, riding slow and steady toward town. Neither spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. By the time they reached the blacksmith's yard at 10:30, 23 people had already gathered. Moses stood at his forge. The fire banked low but ready. Ruth Carver was there, in her Sunday dress, her face set with determination, Tom Brennan and his ranch hands. The merchants from Main Street, the mill workers, Daniel Pritchard with his packet of letters, and Elizabeth Wickham, the judge's daughter, standing straight-backed and fearless in the morning light. They looked like what they were, ordinary people who'd decided they were tired of being afraid. Moses caught Caleb's eye and nodded once. Then he reached into the forge and pulled out the gate iron he'd been working all week, now finished and polished to a dull shine. He wrapped it in oilcloth and set it aside. For later, he said to Sarah, when you go home. At 11 o'clock, they began to walk. 25 people moving through the streets of town, toward the square, their boots raising dust in the dry air. People came to their windows to watch. Shopkeepers stepped out onto their porches. Children stopped their games and stared. By the time they reached the town square, a crowd had gathered. Not just witnesses, but curious onlookers, people who'd heard rumors and wanted to see what would happen. 40 people, then 50, then more. Caleb helped Sarah up onto the auction block where she'd been struck 4 days ago. Moses climbed up beside them, his leather apron still on, his hands dark with forge work. Ruth joined them, then Tom, then Daniel Pritchard, clutching his letters like they were made of fire. The murmur of the crowd died down to silence. Sheriff Crenshaw pushed through the gathering, his face tight with worry. What's this about, Stone? This is about asking questions the law won't, Caleb said, his voice carrying across the square. About Benjamin Drummond's signature on a promissory note. About whether a dead man can borrow money 3 weeks after he's buried. A ripple went through all the crowd. Vernon Hask emerged from the bank across the street, flanked by 2 hired men. His face was flushed red, his eyes dangerous. "This is mob rule," Hask shouted. "Sheriff, arrest these people for disturbing the peace." "I'm listening first," Crenshaw said slowly. He looked at the crowd, 60 people now, maybe more, and seemed to realize that arresting anyone would start something he couldn't stop. "Speak your piece, Stone." Caleb nodded to Moses. The blacksmith pulled his ledger from under his arm and held it high. "I've been witnessing signatures in this town for 40 years. Benjamin Drummond signed documents in my presence 40 times. Land sales, livestock contracts, his will. I recorded every one." He opened the ledger. "Every signature matches the note Mrs. Drummond holds. The $340 loan from April 1876. Clean signature, confident hand." Moses pulled out Hask's forged note and held it beside the ledger. Even from 20 feet away, the difference was obvious. "This note claiming $890? Moses's voice rang like his anvil. "This ain't Ben Drummond's hand. I'd stake my forge and my name on it." "That's one man's opinion," Hask called out. "Not proof?" "Then here's 14 more opinions," Tom Brennan said, stepping forward. One by one, the witnesses came forward. Ranch hands and merchants and mill workers, each one speaking 10 seconds of truth. "I saw Ben Drummond sign his will. That's his mark. The banknote ain't. I witnessed his signature on a cattle sale. Same hand as Mrs. Drummond's note, different from Hask's claim. I bought land from Ben Drummond. He signed the deed in front of me and Judge Wickham both. That signature don't match what Hask's got." 14 voices, 14 testimonies, each one another nail in Hask's lie. The crowd had swelled to 80 people now, all silent, all watching. Judge Wickham himself had emerged from his office above the general store, standing at the top of the stairs with his hand gripping the railing. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the trembling in her bandaged hands. "My husband died August 12th, 1876. Fever took him in 3 days, and she pulled out Benjamin's note, the original, with the date written in the margin. He borrowed $340 on April 2nd. He kept this copy because he always paid his debts, and he wanted proof of terms." She held up Hask's forged note. "This claims to be from September 1876. My husband was dead by then. He'd been in the ground 5 weeks. Her voice rose. "Dead men don't sign documents, Mr. Hask. So, either my husband came back from the grave to borrow money from you, or you're a liar and a thief." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Hask's face had gone from red to white. That's a forgery itself," he stammered. "She's lying about the dates." "No, she ain't," said a voice from the crowd. An old woman stepped forward, Mrs. Henderson from the general store. "I was at Ben Drummond's funeral, August 15th, 18th. I remember because it was my husband's birthday, and he said it was a sad way to mark the day." She looked at Hask with contempt. "Ben Drummond was dead in September. Everyone in this town knows it." More voices rose from the crowd, confirming the date. The tide had turned, and Hask could feel it. "Sheriff," he said desperately, "these people are in contempt of a legal foreclosure." "Show me one witness," Sheriff Crenshaw said quietly. "Who saw Ben Drummond sign your note?" "Just one." Hask's mouth opened and closed. No words came. Daniel Pritchard stepped forward, his young face pale but resolute. "He can't produce a witness because he forged it alone. I worked for Mr. Hask for 2 years. I filed his claims and recorded his documents, and I saw him forge signatures when he thought no one was looking." He held up the packet of letters. "And I saw these. Anonymous threats sent to Judge Wickham, describing his daughter's daily routine, threatening her safety if the judge didn't rule in Hask's favor." The crowd's murmur became a roar. Judge Wickham's face had gone ashen. Elizabeth Wickham pushed through the crowd and climbed onto the platform beside Sarah. "Those letters are real," she said, her voice ringing clear. "My father showed them to me. He's been terrified for months, but I'm here now, standing in front of this whole town, and I'm not afraid anymore." She looked directly at Hask. "Your threats have no power when they're spoken out loud." Moses raised his hammer high and brought it down on the portable anvil he'd dragged to the square. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound rang out like a church bell, like a declaration, like truth being forged in fire. "By my forge and my name," Moses said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "I swear that signature is false, and I call on every person here who values truth to witness it." The crowd began to press forward, not threatening, but surrounding. 80 people, then 90, all moving closer to the platform where Sarah stood with her defenders. The sheer mass of them was a wall that Hask couldn't talk through, couldn't buy off, couldn't intimidate. Sheriff Crenshaw looked at the crowd, at the witnesses, at Judge Wickham, standing frozen at the top of his stairs. Then he looked at Vernon Hask. "Mr. Hask," the sheriff said slowly, "I'm going to need you to come with me. We've got questions about document forgery and criminal intimidation that need answering." "Wow, this is outrageous," Hask's voice cracked. I have lawyers. I have rights. So did Mrs. Drummond, Crenshaw said. And you violated every one of them. He gestured to his deputy. Take him. As the deputy moved forward, Hask's composure finally shattered. Fine. Yes, I forged the interest claim. But she still owes the original $340, and the land's worth 10 times that, with the creek access. The crowd went silent. Every person there had just heard Vernon Hask confess to fraud in front of 90 witnesses. Judge Wickham descended the stairs slowly, his face a mixture of relief and shame. When he reached the platform, he looked at his daughter first, then at Sarah. Mrs. Drummond, he said, his voice formal but shaking. Your debt is restored to its original terms. $340, payable, under the conditions your husband agreed to. The foreclosure is voided. The property remains yours. He turned to the sheriff. Mr. Hask is under arrest for fraud, forgery, and criminal intimidation. Hold him for trial. And as Hask was led away, still sputtering, still threatening lawyers and connections that no longer mattered, the crowd began to applaud. Not loud, not celebratory, but with the quiet satisfaction of people who'd watched justice actually work for once. Sarah collapsed into Caleb's arms, and he held her while she cried. Not from despair this time, but from relief so profound it had nowhere to go but out. Moses climbed down from the platform and retrieved his wrapped gate iron. Ready to go home, Mrs. Drummond? Saturday afternoon found a small group riding out to the Drummond farm. Caleb and Sarah, Moses with his rapid gate iron, Tom Brennan, and Ruth Carver with a basket of supplies. The land looked different now, somehow. Still the same scrub brush and dust, the same worn fence line and weathered house, but transformed by the knowledge that it belonged to Sarah again. They spent 2 hours setting things right. Tom and his men repaired the foreclosure notice damage where Pritchard had nailed it to the door. Ruth swept out the house and opened the windows to let fresh air chase out the staleness of abandonment. Moses and Caleb installed the new gate iron, the metal sliding into place with a smooth click that spoke of craftsmanship and care. When the gate swung open, silent now, no more grinding or catching, Sarah ran her hand over the repair work. The iron was warm from the afternoon sun, and Moses had stamped his mark into the metal. A small anvil, proof of honest work. It's stronger than before, she said. Things that break can be mended, Moses replied. Stronger at the seams. Sarah walked through her house slowly, touching the table where she and Ben had eaten breakfast, the chair where he'd sat to read his Bible, the window where she'd watched for his return from town. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it felt different now. Less like drowning, more like remembering. In the bedroom, she opened the trunk and pulled out Ben's good shirt, the one he'd worn to church. She held it to her face, breathing in the faint scent of him that still lingered in the fabric, and let herself cry one more time for the life they'd planned and the children they'd never have. Then she folded the shirt carefully, placed it back in the trunk, and closed the lid. When she emerged, Caleb was standing on the porch, looking out at the land. She joined him there, and they stood in comfortable silence while the sun began its descent toward the western hills. I owe you $340, she said finally. At $1 a day, that's 340 days, Caleb finished. Little less than a year. I'll work it honest, every penny. I know you will. He glanced at her. But there's no rush. You can stay at the ranch while you work off the debt. Or you can come back here, and I'll ride over each day to collect your labor. Your choice.
Mine.
Sarah thought about the small cabin at Stone's ranch, the way the fire crackled in the stone hearth, the morning coffee ritual, the companionable silence of working fence line together. She thought about this house, empty except for memories and the ghost of what might have been. I'll stay at your place, she said quietly. For now, until the debt's clear. Then I'll come back here and start over proper. And after that? She looked at him, really looked, at the weathered face and the eyes that had learned to feel again after 12 years of numbness. At the man who'd risked his ranch to stand beside a woman he barely knew because it was right. After that, she said, I reckon I'll need a partner. Someone who knows cattle and fence mending and how to stand when standing costs something. She paused. Know anybody like that? Caleb's lips twitched into something almost like a smile. I might. They loaded the wagon with the things Sarah wanted to bring back. Clothes, cookware, Ben's Bible, the quilt his mother had made. Moses climbed up beside Ruth, and Tom mounted his horse. As the group prepared to leave, Judge Wickham rode up the path, his daughter Elizabeth beside him. Mrs. Drummond, the judge said, dismounting, I wanted to apologize for my cowardice, for letting fear control my decisions, for— You're here now, Sarah interrupted gently. That's what matters. Elizabeth stepped forward and took Sarah's hands. Thank you for standing when my father couldn't, for showing him that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. Judge Wickham cleared his throat. I'm retiring from the bench, effective immediately. I've recommended to the territorial governor that Moses Webb be considered for justice of the peace. This town needs someone who understands that the law is supposed to serve justice, not the other way around. Moses looked startled. I'm a blacksmith, not a lawyer. You're a man who knows truth when he sees it, Wickham said. That's worth more than all the legal training in the world. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, the group rode back toward town. Sarah took one last look at her farm, at the house where she'd been a wife, at the gate that had been broken and was now mended, at the land that had almost been stolen but was hers again. Tomorrow, she'd wake in Caleb Stone's spare room and make coffee and work fence line and begin the long, steady process of paying an honest debt to an honest man. And in a year, when that debt was clear, she'd come back here and plant a garden and raise cattle, and maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't come back alone. But that was tomorrow, and next month, and next year. Today was for riding toward the ranch, with the evening light warm on her face and the knowledge that sometimes, when you stand for what's right, the whole town stands with you. Caleb Stone stood on his porch that evening, coffee in hand, watching the sun bleed out behind the western ridge. The sky turned from gold to crimson to deep purple, and the first stars began to emerge like promises kept. Inside the cabin, Sarah was washing the supper dishes, humming something soft and wordless. The sound drifted through the open door, mixing with the evening birdsong and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. It was a small sound, an ordinary sound, but it filled the silence that had lived in this cabin for 12 years. He'd been wrong about so many things. Wrong to think that keeping your head down was wisdom. Wrong to believe that caring about people only led to pain. Wrong to spend 12 years telling himself that survival and living were the same thing. They weren't. Survival was breathing and eating and watching days pass like fence posts along an empty road. Living was standing in a town square with your heart exposed and your ranch at risk, choosing courage over safety because some things mattered more than keeping what you had. Vernon Hask would spend the next 5 years in territorial prison. The town had its conscience back. Judge Wickham had found his courage, even if it came late. And Sarah Drummond had her land, her dignity, and a future that looked different from what she'd planned but no less real for the changing. The coffee was still hot. The evening air smelled of sage and dust and the promise of rain gathering somewhere beyond the mountains. Tomorrow, Sarah would help him mend the north fence line. Next week, Moses would officiate his first case as Justice of the Peace. Next year, when Sarah's debt was paid, they'd see what came after. But tonight was for standing on this porch, feeling the solid wood beneath his boots, knowing that the land he stood on was worth more than its deed because he'd been willing to risk it for what was right. Some debts don't show on ledgers, some are paid in silence, and others in witness. He'd paid his, and in the paying, he'd found something he thought he'd lost 12 years ago, in a grave on a hill behind the church. He'd found a reason to stand.